Hong Kong, December 1964. 7 men were inside a second-floor apartment above a herbal shop on Nathan Road. The windows were shut despite the humidity. The curtains drawn. One of those men, a part-time film extra named Chan Wai Lam, would later say, no one wanted word of it spreading. Not yet. Bruce Lee never publicly described what happened in that room. Not in interviews. Not in letters. And certainly not on camera. But at least 3 of the men present gave private accounts years later, quiet recollections shared over dinners, in back offices of training halls, in conversations that ended with long pauses. A visiting veteran karate master from Japan had arrived in Hong Kong 2 days earlier. He was in his 40s. Compact. Thick wrists. Known for full contact conditioning drills that left students hospitalized. He believed Chinese kung fu was theatrical, too ornate, too cooperative. He asked to meet one of the young instructors making noise. Bruce was 24. By the end of the encounter, one man would be bleeding from the mouth. Another would be shaken in a way none of them expected. And Bruce Lee, already controversial, would make a decision that altered the direction of his training permanently. No one called the police. No one filmed it. But the men who stood against the walls that night agreed on one detail: it could have ended much worse than it did. The method has never been publicly detailed. Only the result. Hong Kong, 1964. When Bruce Lee returned to Hong Kong in early 1964, he was not arriving as a conquering hero. He was a 24-year-old instructor with a reputation that made older masters uneasy. He had grown up in the city, trained in Wing Chun under Ip Man, and left for the United States as a teenager. In Seattle and Oakland, he began teaching Chinese martial arts to non-Chinese students, an act that had already stirred resentment within certain traditional circles. By the time he came back to Hong Kong that winter, stories had preceded him. Some described him as brilliant. Others called him reckless. In teahouses near Temple Street and in back rooms of training halls in Sham Shui Po, his name surfaced in conversations that were not entirely friendly. He had been quoted criticizing rigid forms training. He questioned whether stylized routines prepared anyone for a resisting opponent. He had begun demonstrating direct, economical movements, short punches, low kicks, forward pressure, without elaborate pre-fight ceremony. To some, this was innovation. To others, it was disrespect. Hong Kong in the mid-1960s was not a unified martial arts community. It was a network of lineages: Wing Chun, Choi Li Fut, Hung Gar, White Crane, each protective of its history. Reputation was currency. A public loss could cripple a school's enrollment. A rumor of weakness could spread through dockworkers and film studios in a matter of days. Bruce's status at the time was unstable. He had skill. No one who trained with him denied that. But he was young, outspoken, and recently returned from America with ideas that sounded foreign even when spoken in Cantonese. Several instructors saw him as someone who needed to be tested. The controversy was not merely technical. It was generational. Older masters had endured poverty, colonial pressure, and gang territory disputes. Their training halls were built on discipline and hierarchy. Bruce, by contrast, moved between film sets and Western-influenced gyms. He spoke openly about adaptation, efficiency, personal expression. Those words sounded to some like rebellion. It was in this atmosphere that news circulated of a visiting Japanese karate veteran making inquiries. Not loudly. Not in public demonstrations. Quietly. He had heard about the young man who speaks too freely. Karate in 1964 carried its own hardened reputation. Post-war dojo training in Japan had emphasized body conditioning and direct striking. There were internal challenge matches, no points, no protective gear. Some Hong Kong practitioners viewed Japanese karate as rigid but powerful. Others viewed it as aggressive and politically symbolic, given recent history. If a Japanese veteran publicly humbled a Chinese instructor in Hong Kong, the implications would extend beyond 2 men. That is what made the challenge matter. Bruce was not yet a global figure. There were no film contracts defining his public image. His credibility rested entirely on what happened in rooms with wooden floors and watchful eyes. He understood this. According to Lao Sing, who would later stand against the wall that December night, Bruce had been unusually quiet the week leading up to the meeting. He was not joking the way he usually did, Lao recalled. He trained longer on the heavy bag. Harder. And he was running more. There was also something else, something less visible. Bruce had built his confidence on speed and precision. On intercepting attacks before they formed. But he had not yet faced many full-contact tests against larger, fully conditioned opponents outside his own training circles. If the visiting karate master was as durable as described, speed alone might not end the encounter quickly. And in a small city where martial reputations traveled faster than newspapers, even a draw could be interpreted as weakness. This was not simply about pride. It was about whether his ideas could survive resistance. By December 1964, the tension had condensed into a private arrangement. No public venue. No formal announcement. Just a borrowed apartment above a shop, a locked door, and a question that would not remain theoretical much longer. Bruce Lee was about to discover whether his criticism of tradition could withstand a man who had been forged inside one. And those who gathered that night understood something unspoken: if he failed, he would not get a second introduction to Hong Kong. The city was watching, whether it admitted it or not. Tanaka Hiroshi, the name most witnesses recall, was a man whose presence seemed to alter the room before any movement began. Not tall, roughly 5 feet 8 inches, but dense with muscle and scar tissue that mapped decades of combat conditioning. His forearms were thick, almost rope-like, evidence of repeated makiwara strikes. Calluses layered over older injuries that had never fully healed. According to Chan Wai Lam, he walked into the apartment with a purposeful gait, shoulders squared, his eyes scanning the floorboards as if measuring both distance and tension. He looked like he belonged in a ring where no one else survived the first round, Chan said years later. Tanaka's reputation in Japan was partly documented and partly whispered. He had fought in bare-knuckle dojo matches during the 1950s, contests that were designed not for sport, but to test endurance, timing, and the ability to absorb repeated strikes without faltering. These matches were rarely reported in print. Injuries were common: broken ribs, shattered knuckles, nose bleeds, but survivors carried credibility. What made him dangerous was not just physicality. Witness Lao Sing later explained, he moved like someone who expected every strike to hurt him and every block to cost something. He didn't fake readiness. He carried consequence in his posture. Tanaka's approach emphasized linear power. Every step, every punch, every kick was direct. No flourish. Minimal movement. In close range, he was explosive. He did not hesitate to drive his weight forward into the opponent. In that sense, he was the opposite of Bruce, rigid but consistent. Bruce's style relied on fluidity, interception, and economy of motion. Critically, Tanaka was not seeking publicity. He had no entourage. No cameras. No reporters. When he asked to meet Bruce, it was not a staged demonstration for film studios or curious spectators. It was a personal test of skill, and a defense of his own reputation. He had heard rumors of a young Chinese instructor claiming efficiency and speed could defeat experience and conditioning. In Tanaka's mind, that claim demanded verification. The witnesses, including Lao Sing and Bruce's cousin, would later describe an unspoken acknowledgement between the two men when they first faced each other. There was tension, yes, but also measured respect. Tanaka did not underestimate Bruce. Bruce, for the first time that evening, recognized the man across from him as a real threat. Not a cinematic villain. Not a student. Not a sparring partner. A full-contact, battle-tested practitioner. Physical credibility alone did not define Tanaka's danger. Psychological weight also mattered. His presence carried authority, intimidation, and a calm readiness to punish mistakes. Witnesses recall the silence that followed his removal of the jacket. No words were exchanged, but the room felt denser, heavier. There was the sense that every move would be remembered, and any misstep could result in tangible injury. Finally, Tanaka had a history that made him credible in the eyes of those who knew the martial world. His victories in Japanese dojo circuits were private but notorious among insiders. Stories of him continuing to spar while bleeding from the nose, ignoring broken fingers, and driving opponents to collapse from exhaustion circulated quietly but reliably. Bruce would have to contend with this. Speed and precision were his weapons, but he had yet to face a man whose conditioning and intent were unyielding. The challenge that night was no exhibition. It was a test of survival, skill, and psychological endurance. And witnesses would later confirm that for the first exchange, both men paused, measuring each other, not as teachers, but as opponents who understood that the coming minutes could leave one or both bloodied, embarrassed, or permanently altered. The location itself shaped the encounter before a single strike was thrown. The apartment was a rented space above a herbal shop in Kowloon, 2 flights up a narrow staircase that creaked under each footfall. The room measured roughly 14 by 16 feet, its wooden planks slightly uneven, worn from decades of previous tenants. Every step shifted the weight of the floor subtly, a detail that would matter when speed and balance became crucial. The windows were closed against the December humidity, and the thin curtains trapped light into dim rectangles on the walls. The apartment's low ceiling, just under 8 feet, compressed movement. There was no room for wide circular maneuvers. The fight would be linear, close, and unforgiving. There were no gloves, no protective padding, no referee. The only rule agreed upon was the absence of weapons. Otherwise, the encounter was raw. 3 witnesses were present. Chan Wai Lam, the film extra, leaned against the wall, hands tucked into his coat pockets, eyes scanning the room nervously. Lao Sing, a Wing Chun practitioner, stood closer to the corner, head cocked, observing stances and weight distribution. Bruce's cousin, who requested anonymity, hovered behind them, clutching a notebook that he would never later publish, recording silent impressions of movement, breathing, and intention. The emotional atmosphere was thick. Silence dominated. There was no banter, no verbal warning. The tension was physical, tangible. Witnesses later remarked that it was like walking into a space where every muscle knew something violent was about to happen. Even the air seemed heavier. Bruce did not stretch. He stood upright, shoulders relaxed but ready. Tanaka removed his jacket deliberately, rolling the sleeves of his GI-like top to expose forearms layered with calluses and scars. It was a statement: I am prepared. I have nothing to hide. The 2 men eyed each other across the 8-foot gap, each weighing reach, stance, and likely first strike. There was no bow. There was no ritual. Just a silent acknowledgement of mutual recognition. This was a confrontation, not a demonstration. Chan later remembered noticing the smallest details, how Bruce's fingers were slightly splayed, ready to trap or parry, how Tanaka's shoulders rose and fell with minimal motion, conserving energy but radiating readiness. Every second was an assessment, Chan said. Neither one was guessing. Every move had consequence before it happened. The witnesses' positions were deliberate as well. They leaned along walls, careful to remain outside striking range but close enough to observe subtleties, the tilt of a hip, the micro-shift of a weight-bearing foot, the tightening of a jaw before contact. By the time the first strike occurred, everyone understood the stakes. This was not a rehearsal. One misjudged move could result in real injury. A broken rib, a bruised kidney, or a knocked-out tooth. The smallness of the room and the hardness of the floor amplified risk, meaning that every hit carried amplified consequence. Emotionally, the room was a pressure cooker. Bruce faced someone who could deliver genuine harm without hesitation. Tanaka faced someone whose reputation had begun to threaten traditional authority. And the witnesses were caught in the middle, unable to intervene, but fully aware that their observations could become evidence of a historic confrontation. The locked door made the encounter intimate and inescapable. It was a controlled environment in one sense, contained, private, but uncontrollable in another. Every misstep, every decision, every strike could not be undone. The psychological weight of that fact pressed on both men even before movement began. At that moment, Bruce realized that this would be more than a test of speed or technique. It would be a test of endurance, decision-making under stress, and moral choice, how far to push a dangerous man before the consequences became unacceptable. The encounter began without fanfare. Tanaka took the first step, advancing deliberately, hips aligned, fists loose but ready to coil with power. His lead hand extended first, a straight punch aimed at Bruce's centerline. The strike was not theatrical, it carried the weight of intent and conditioning honed over decades. Bruce did not retreat conventionally. Instead, he executed a subtle shift offline, less than 6 inches, slightly angling his torso while maintaining eye contact. Simultaneously, he delivered a straight lead punch targeting Tanaka's sternum. Witnesses disagreed on which strike landed first, but all agreed on the physical resonance, a thud, not a cinematic crack, as fist met flesh. Tanaka absorbed it, chest compressing, forearms tightening to deflect the impact, and pressed forward without pause. The movement revealed the first psychological layer of the fight. Tanaka's conditioning allowed him to continue immediately, refusing the natural pause that most would take after absorbing a strike. Bruce, for the first time in such a controlled environment, felt the presence of a man who could endure. This was not a sparring partner. Not a student. Not an exaggeration. It was a body trained to persist, regardless of pain. Tanaka's follow-up was a low kick toward Bruce's thigh, striking partially but hard enough to disrupt stance. Bruce's leg buckled slightly, forcing a micro-adjustment in balance. He countered with a rapid vertical punch aimed at the ribs, precise, yet controlled, designed to probe rather than demolish. The room tightened. Every movement was measured. Every strike carried potential for significant injury. Witness Lao Singh later recalled the sound, not a crack like in films, more like the weight of a man suddenly stopped in the wrong place. The air itself shifted. Tanaka responded with a short hook toward Bruce's torso. Bruce pivoted, trapping momentarily, then disengaged, stepping back only slightly. Speed was evident, but so was resistance. This was the first clear demonstration that Bruce could not rely solely on agility. The opponent was absorbing, adapting, and maintaining pressure. Psychologically, the first exchange left Bruce with a rare awareness: his typical strategies, interception, speed, fluid movement, would not be enough. The opponent's resilience forced him to consider leverage, positioning, and timing with more precision than ever before. Tanaka's eyes, steady and unflinching, communicated a quiet message: you may be faster, but you are not invulnerable. Bruce's breathing remained controlled, but his chest rose and fell slightly faster than before, a physiological signal of both exertion and heightened vigilance. For the witnesses, the tension was palpable. They could see Bruce's fingers flexing, ready to trap or redirect, and Tanaka's knuckles tensing with each step, ready to strike. There was no hesitation, but there was respect for each other's capacity to inflict real harm. The first exchange ended without dramatic knockdowns or bloodshed, but with a subtle shift. Bruce understood that this was not about landing an immediate decisive strike. It was about endurance, adaptability, and the careful calibration of force. Tanaka's calm, unyielding forward pressure had revealed a vulnerability in Bruce's own psychological assessment. He had underestimated what a fully conditioned, resistant opponent could absorb. The room remained silent. The witnesses exhaled almost imperceptibly. Bruce's eyes met Tanaka's for a brief moment, acknowledging the first truth of the fight: speed alone would not secure victory, and any escalation carried real consequences. It was a pause pregnant with anticipation, a turning point where the fight would shift from demonstration to full consequence. The tension that had built in the first exchange escalated immediately. Tanaka closed the distance deliberately, leaving little room for Bruce to maneuver. The apartment's narrow space forced chest-to-chest proximity, and every movement now carried weight. One misjudged strike could target bone or joint instead of muscle. One overextension could result in a fall on the wooden floor. Tanaka's fist struck low, driving into Bruce's ribs with a rhythm that left no pause. On the second impact, Bruce felt a sharp ache radiate along his lower right ribs. He adjusted his stance, absorbing the blow with a controlled twist of the torso, but the pain was immediate and undeniable. Blood rose to his mind not from injury, but from the realization, this man was conditioned to endure, to continue, to push forward regardless of pain. Witness Lao Singh later recalled Bruce's micro-expressions, a fleeting grimace, a quick tightening of the jaw, a subtle clench of the fists. It was a momentary crack in his composure, enough for the observer to sense the weight of the danger he faced. Bruce's breathing became shallow, rapid, yet he retained focus, scanning the smallest gaps in Tanaka's defense. Every movement required calculation, how to strike effectively without exposing himself to real harm. Bruce responded with a series of rapid vertical punches, striking toward Tanaka's jaw and temple. Blood appeared at the corner of Tanaka's mouth, but he did not falter. He rotated slightly, using his shoulder to absorb impact and immediately drove a short hook toward Bruce's solar plexus. The force jolted Bruce backward slightly. The collision of precision and resilience became evident. This was no ordinary sparring session. It was a measured collision between two trained bodies, each capable of inflicting serious injury. At this moment, Bruce faced a critical moral and strategic decision. His own ability allowed him to deliver strikes that could incapacitate Tanaka quickly, a knee aimed at the midsection, a side kick to the thigh, even a targeted strike to the throat. But each option carried the potential for permanent damage. The choice was not about whether he could win, it was about how far he would go to assert dominance while maintaining control over consequences. Bruce's eyes, narrowed in concentration, scanned Tanaka's stance. He executed a low side kick that struck the Japanese master's knee with precision. Tanaka staggered, but did not collapse. The room seemed to pause, an awareness of limits, control, and responsibility compressed every breath. Bruce could have followed immediately with another high-impact strike, yet he chose restraint. Witness Chan later reflected, I knew then he could have finished it. He didn't. And in that choice, something larger than skill emerged. Tanaka attempted to recover fully but could not stabilize immediately. Bruce's decision to step back, to halt the escalation, created a psychological shift in the room. The fight had been brutal in intent, yet measured in execution. Both men now understood that victory was not solely about overpowering the other, it was about understanding the boundary between control and destruction. The emotional weight was now acute. Bruce felt the duality of his own potential, the precision, speed, and strength that allowed him to harm another human being, and the responsibility to govern that power. For the first time, the theoretical discipline he taught collided with the reality of applying it to someone who could, in turn, punish him for mistakes. The witnesses remained silent but attentive. The room, still narrow and suffused with tension, seemed to vibrate with unspoken comprehension. Every breath, every muscle twitch, every micro-adjustment had been a lesson in endurance, adaptation, and moral control. By the end of this phase, Bruce had not just defended himself, he had confronted his own capacity for harm. And Tanaka, though staggered, remained upright, a living testament to resilience. The fight was no longer just physical, it had become psychological, ethical, and deeply personal, leaving both men, and the witnesses, marked by the intensity of the encounter. The encounter ended quietly. Tanaka Hiroshi left Hong Kong within 48 hours. No press coverage, no public statements, no film cameras to immortalize the event. The apartment was emptied, swept, and returned to its landlord, leaving behind only the memory of a confrontation that had tested skill, endurance, and judgment. For Bruce, the psychological impact was immediate and lasting. Witness Chan Wai Lam remembered seeing Bruce sit alone on the wooden floor afterward, hands braced behind him, breathing still measured but eyes distant. He wasn't celebrating, Chan said. He looked heavy, like he had carried something through the fight that wasn't his opponent's. Bruce reportedly intensified his physical conditioning following the night. Roadwork extended into the early mornings. Heavy bag drills increased in frequency and duration. Structural conditioning, targeting the ribs, forearms, and legs, became a central focus. He wrote in private notes, later referenced by close associates, that speed and precision alone were insufficient. A fighter must also survive sustained, high-pressure resistance. Witness Lao Singh reflected years later on the emotional resonance of that night. He proved he could dominate a man with skill. But what stayed with him, and with those of us who watched, was what he didn't do. The restraint, the calculation. The awareness of how far he could push without crossing a line. For the witnesses, the encounter reframed their understanding of Bruce Lee. He was no longer just a talented young instructor. He was a practitioner capable of navigating not only the mechanics of combat but also its moral dimension, the tension between victory and responsibility. The fight became a lens through which they measured his evolution in the years to come. Tanaka himself reportedly returned to Japan without ill will, though deeply impressed. In private correspondence to former students, he noted that Bruce Lee's ability to combine speed, timing, and psychological composure had exceeded expectations. Yet he also noted the restraint shown, an awareness of what could happen if one pushed too far. The broader legacy of that night did not manifest in headlines or accolades. Instead, it shaped Bruce's approach to martial arts, influencing his later emphasis on functional, adaptive systems capable of withstanding unpredictable force. He carried forward an awareness that strength alone was meaningless without discernment, that control could be more impactful than destruction. In private conversations, he would occasionally reference the encounter, not in public, not as boast, but as a measure of personal growth. He observed, "The strongest man in the room is not the one who wins. It's the one who knows exactly how much damage he chose not to do." Those words, spoken quietly, echoed the night's lesson. The fear, tension, and real danger of that apartment above the herbal shop had crystallized a principle that guided his later training, teaching, and encounters. Mastery included self-restraint, moral awareness, and the ability to confront violence without being consumed by it. The men who witnessed the event rarely spoke of it again. When they did, it was in hushed tones, over dinners or in back rooms, never in writing. The memory carried weight, not because of theatrical blows or dramatic knockouts, but because of the moral and psychological stakes fully realized in the room that night. And for Bruce Lee, the lesson endured. The encounter did not create legend through domination alone. It created legend through the quiet, deliberate choices that balanced skill, restraint, and awareness. Silence followed.